What made you call CPS? I work at this grocery store downtown, and there's this woman, Bridget, who's been there for 2 years longer than me. She's 29 with 3 kids, and honestly, her life seems like complete chaos. She's always 20 minutes late minimum, always on her phone arguing with someone about money or babysitters, always asking people to cover her shifts last minute. But whatever. Everyone's got problems, and retail doesn't pay enough for any of us to judge. At first, I felt bad for her because being a single mom looked impossible. She'd come in with her hair still wet from rushing, wearing mismatched shoes, forgetting her name tag half the time. The managers never said anything because we were always short-staffed, and at least she showed up eventually. Her kids would sometimes come in after school, and she'd give them candy from the checkout lanes without paying and tell them to wait in the break room. Nobody wanted to be the person who got a struggling mom fired. Then about 2 months ago, I started noticing her oldest kid, Jason, hanging around outside more and more. He's like 9 or 10 and would sit on this bench by the entrance for hours playing on some old tablet. First, it was just after school for an hour until her shift ended. Then it became him being there at 7, 8, 9 at night. She'd tell him to wait outside because employees couldn't have kids in the break room anymore after the new district manager made that rule. When customers would ask if he was okay, he'd say his mom worked here and she'd be done soon. But soon meant 3 or 4 more hours. I mentioned to Bridget once that Jason had been outside for 2 hours and it was getting dark. She rolled her eyes and said he was fine. He had his tablet and knew not to go anywhere with strangers. She said I didn't understand because I didn't have kids and sometimes you had to make tough choices. She said at least he wasn't home alone like some kids whose parents worked nights. I kept my mouth shut after that, but it bothered me. The kid would be out there in the rain sometimes, just sitting under the little overhang getting splashed. He'd come in to use the bathroom and his lips would be blue from the cold. Other employees started noticing too. Tanya from deli would sneak him hot soup. Robert from produce would give him apples. But nobody wanted to actually say anything to management because Bridget would definitely get fired and then what would happen to those kids? It kept getting worse though. She started picking up extra shifts and Jason would be outside from 4 in the afternoon until 11 at night when we closed. She'd take her breaks and smoke cigarettes out back instead of checking on him. When he'd come looking for her, she'd get annoyed and tell him to go back outside and stop bothering her at work. One night I was leaving after closing and it was past 11:30 and Jason was literally asleep on the bench. Like completely passed out with his tablet dead in his lap and his backpack as a pillow. It was 40 degrees and he was wearing just a thin jacket. His shoes were untied and one had fallen off. He looked so small curled up on that metal bench. I went back inside to find Bridget, and she was in the back room laughing with another coworker about some show they both watched. I told her Jason was asleep outside and it was almost midnight and freezing. She sighed like I was being annoying and said she'd get him in a minute. She was almost done counting her drawer. I stood there for a second realizing she genuinely didn't care that her kid was unconscious outside a grocery store near midnight. That's when I went to my car and called the non-emergency line. I just told them an unattended child was sleeping outside our store, and I was concerned for his safety. I gave them the address and hung up. I didn't give my name or mention Bridget at all. The cops came about 20 minutes later and woke Jason up. Bridget had to leave her drawer half-counted to deal with them. She made up some story about just running inside for a second and losing track of time. They let her take him home, but I guess they made a report. Child services showed up at her apartment the next week according to what she told everyone. They interviewed all 3 kids and the neighbors and checked her house. They found out the younger 2, who were 6 and 4, were being left with Jason to babysit them while she worked doubles. They found out she'd been leaving them alone overnight when she picked up graveyard shifts. They found out there wasn't enough food in the house and the electricity had been shut off twice in the last few months. Yesterday, Bridget came in laughing. She's over by Register 3 telling some story with her hands waving around, and I'm crouched down restocking the bottom shelf of cereal boxes trying to make myself invisible. My heart won't stop pounding because 3 nights ago I sat in my car and dialed that number, and now she's here laughing like nothing happened. I can hear her voice carrying across the store, that loud, cheerful tone she uses when she's in a good mood. Part of me wants to walk out right now and never come back. I grab another box of Cheerios and shove it onto the shelf harder than necessary. She doesn't know it was me. Nobody knows except whoever took that call, and they're not telling her. I keep repeating this in my head, but it doesn't make my hands stop shaking. Tanya's voice joins Bridget's now, and they're both laughing about something. I force myself to stand up and push my cart toward the magazine rack near the registers because I need to know what she's saying. My legs feel weird and disconnected, like I'm walking through water. I pick up a stack of gossip magazines and start straightening them, even though they're already perfectly straight. Bridget's saying something about her apartment being a disaster and how embarrassed she was. I freeze with a magazine halfway onto the rack. She's talking about the CPS visit. She's actually talking about it out loud where anyone can hear. Tanya asks something I can't quite catch, and Bridget laughs again. That laugh makes my stomach twist because it sounds genuine, not bitter or angry like I expected. I move one step closer and pretend to organize the candy bars hanging below the magazines. My hands are shaking so bad I almost knock over the whole display. Bridget's saying the caseworker lady was actually pretty cool, that she helped her fill out applications for programs Bridget didn't even know existed. She's describing how mortified she was about the mess in her apartment, but the caseworker didn't judge her or act superior. She just sat at the kitchen table and went through paperwork with her for like 2 hours. Tanya says something supportive, and Bridget keeps talking about emergency assistance and how she might finally be able to catch up on her electric bill. I'm standing there holding a Snickers bar like an idiot, trying to process this reaction I never saw coming. In my head, I'd imagined her furious, crying, scared about losing her kids. I'd imagined her figuring out it was me and screaming at me in front of everyone. I never imagined her laughing and calling the caseworker cool. The magazine in my other hand slides out and falls on the floor. I bend down to pick it up and stay there longer than necessary because I need a second to breathe. When I stand back up, Bridget's moved on to talking about her schedule for next week. My face feels hot and my shirt is sticking to my back even though the store is freezing like always. I finish with the magazines and wheel my cart toward the back, keeping my head down. Robert's in the produce section spraying down the lettuce when I pass. He glances at me and does a double take. I must look as messed up as I feel. I make it to the employee bathroom and lock myself in one of the stalls. I sit on the closed toilet lid and put my head between my knees like you're supposed to do when you feel faint. The fluorescent light above me is buzzing and flickering. Someone comes in, uses the sink, and leaves. I stay there counting my breaths until my heart rate feels somewhat normal. When I finally come out, I wash my hands for way too long and avoid looking at myself in the mirror. My break isn't for another hour, but I grab my jacket from my locker and head out to my car anyway. Nobody stops me. I sit in the driver's seat with the windows cracked and stare at the employee entrance. The November air is cold enough that I can see my breath. I keep replaying Bridget's laugh in my head, trying to understand it. She was relieved. She actually sounded relieved that CPS came to her apartment and investigated her. That doesn't make sense with anything I expected. I thought calling would help her kids but destroy her, and now I don't know what to think. A knock on my window makes me jump so hard I hit my knee on the steering wheel. Robert's standing there with a cigarette, looking concerned. I roll down the window halfway. He asks if I'm okay because I looked really pale inside. I tell him I'm just tired, didn't sleep well last night. He takes a drag and gives me this look that makes my chest tight. It's not suspicious exactly, more like understanding. Like he knows something without me having to say it. He asks if I heard Bridget talking about the CPS thing. I nod because I can't trust my voice right now. He says it's good someone finally did something, that he's been worried about those kids for months. The way he says someone lands heavy between us. I look down at my hands gripping the steering wheel. He tells me he's glad the caseworker seems helpful instead of just punishing, that maybe Bridget will actually get the support she needs. Then he flicks his cigarette and heads back inside. I sit there for another 10 minutes before I can make myself go back to work. The next day, Bridget's restocking the candy aisle when I walk past with my pricing gun. She's humming something under her breath and organizing the chocolate bars by type. She looks up when she sees me and starts talking like we're in the middle of a conversation. She tells me CPS connected her with this subsidized after-school program for all 3 kids starting next week. It's at the community center just 2 blocks away and they can stay until 7, which covers most of her shifts. She sounds excited about it, listing off all the activities they'll have. Arts and crafts for the younger ones, homework help for Jason, a gym for rainy days. I'm standing there with my pricing gun pointed at a jar of peanut butter, not moving. She keeps talking about how it's basically free, just $5 a week per kid, and they even provide snacks. Her voice has this lightness I've never heard before. I manage to say that sounds really great, that it'll be good for them. She agrees and says she feels stupid for not knowing these programs existed, that she's been paying her neighbor $40 a day to watch them and the neighbor mostly just let them watch TV. I nod and price another item. She mentions the program has dinner included too, so that's one less meal to figure out. The relief in her voice when she says that makes me feel strange. I'm glad my call helped, but I still went behind her back and reported her to authorities. I told strangers that she was neglecting her kids. Even if it worked out okay, that's what I did. She moves down the aisle to restock the gummy bears, and I escape to the next section. My hands won't stop shaking for the rest of my shift. 2 days later, Tanya catches me heading into the walk-in cooler to grab more milk crates. She follows me in and closes the door behind us. The cold air hits my face, and I can see both our breaths in the dim light. She asks me directly if I was the one who called about Jason that night. Her voice isn't mean or accusing, just curious and quiet. I freeze with my hand on a milk crate. She says she's not trying to start anything. She just wants to know. I don't say yes or no, but I can feel my face doing something that gives me away. She steps closer and squeezes my arm. She tells me someone needed to, that she's been feeling guilty for months about not doing it herself. She was working the closing shift 2 weeks before I made the call and found Jason asleep out there, and she just woke him up and told him to go find his mom. She's been losing sleep over it ever since. I tell her I understand, and she squeezes my arm again before letting go. We both stand there in the cold for a minute, not saying anything. Then she grabs the crates she came for and pushes back out into the store. I stay in the cooler for another minute, letting the cold air sting my face. At least one person knows now and doesn't hate me for it. Over the next week, I start noticing the bench by the entrance sitting empty during evening shifts. The first couple times I think maybe Jason's just inside with Bridget. But then I remember she said the program goes until 7. I'm taking out trash one evening and I see the bench in the yellow light from the parking lot. It looks different without a small kid hunched over a dead tablet. Bridget mentions during a shift change that Jason loves the program, that he's made friends with 2 other boys his age. She says they play basketball in the gym and he's getting pretty good. She tells me the program includes dinner, and yesterday they had spaghetti, and Jason said it was better than anything she makes at home. She laughs when she says this, but there's something sad underneath it. I tell her it's great that he's making friends, and she agrees. She says the younger 2 love it too, that they come home tired in a good way instead of wired from watching TV all day. She heads to her register, and I finish stocking the shelf I'm working on. The bench stays empty night after night, and I try not to think about all the hours Jason spent out there before I finally made that call. The CPS caseworker comes in during my shift the following Tuesday. I recognize her from the description Bridget gave. A woman in her 40s with short gray hair and a canvas bag covered in pins. She goes straight to the manager's office, and I watch through the window while pretending to organize the impulse buy shelves near the registers. The manager looks uncomfortable, shifting in his chair and rubbing his neck. The caseworker is talking and gesturing, probably asking about Bridget's schedule. Our scheduling system is designed so the company can change shifts with 2 hours' notice, not so employees can have consistent hours they can plan around. The manager is explaining something, and the caseworker is writing in a notebook. They talk for maybe 20 minutes, and then she leaves through the front entrance. The manager comes out of his office looking annoyed and goes straight to the break room. I know nothing will probably change with Bridget's schedule because that would require corporate to care about employee stability over their own flexibility. But at least someone asked. At least someone official said that erratic scheduling makes it impossible for single parents to arrange childcare. That's more than anyone here has done. During a slow afternoon later that week, Bridget's telling a group of coworkers about the parenting classes CPS is making her attend. She rolls her eyes while describing it, saying she has to go twice a month for 6 months, and they do home checks too. One of the newer guys asks if that's scary, and she shrugs. She admits the parenting class teacher is actually helpful. That last week she gave Bridget information about tenant rights when Bridget mentioned her landlord won't fix the heat. She says she didn't know she could report landlords for that stuff, that she thought she just had to deal with whatever the landlord decided. I'm restocking soup cans nearby, and I can hear everything. She's talking about the investigation I caused like it's just another annoying thing she has to deal with, not something that could have destroyed her life. She mentions the home checks are monthly, and they look at everything from food in the fridge to whether the smoke detectors work. She laughs and says she's been cleaning more in the past 2 weeks than she has all year. The other coworkers laugh with her. I stack another can and try to focus on getting the labels facing forward. The strange feeling in my chest won't go away. I triggered this investigation that's requiring her to take classes and submit to home inspections, and she's treating it like a minor inconvenience that comes with some unexpected benefits. I don't know how to feel about that. Robert finds me during my break later that week when I'm sitting in my car again. He taps on the window and I roll it down. He's not smoking this time, just standing there with his hands in his pockets. He tells me quietly that he's glad someone finally called about Jason. He says he's been losing sleep over it for months, watching that kid sit outside in the cold. But he has his own kids to feed and he couldn't risk making waves at work. His voice gets quieter when he says this. He tells me he knows what it's like to need every single paycheck and not be able to afford principals. I tell him I understand, and I do. We were all trapped between wanting to help and needing to survive. That collective paralysis let a 10-year-old sit outside a grocery store until midnight in 40-degree weather. Robert says at least it's over now. At least Jason has somewhere warm to go. I nod but don't say anything else. He heads back inside, and I sit there thinking about how many of us saw what was happening and did nothing until I finally broke. The guilt of our shared silence doesn't feel any lighter, even though the outcome seems okay. We all failed that kid for months before one of us finally acted. 2 weeks after the investigation, I'm working the early shift when a group of kids comes through the entrance with 2 adults wearing community center shirts. They're on some kind of field trip, clipboards in hand and matching blue lanyards around their necks. I'm restocking the bread aisle when they pass, and I glance over out of habit. Jason's in the middle of the group walking next to another boy about his age. They're both laughing about something and comparing notes on their clipboards. I stop moving and just stare. He looks completely different. His jacket actually fits and isn't threadbare at the elbows. His hair is cut neatly instead of hanging in his eyes. His shoes are tied and they match. But the biggest difference is his face. He's smiling a real smile, not the tired, flat expression he used to wear while sitting on that bench. The group moves toward the produce section, and one of the adults starts explaining something about nutrition. Jason doesn't notice me standing there with a loaf of bread in each hand. I'm grateful for that because I have no idea what I'd say to him. I'm the person who reported his mother. I'm the reason CPS came to his apartment and interviewed him and his siblings and looked through their whole lives. Even if it helped, even if he's better off now, I'm still the person who made that call. I finish restocking the bread and go to the back room where I can't see the field trip group anymore. I'm in the dairy section 2 days later when Bridget finds me. She's holding a clipboard and checking off inventory items, but she stops and calls my name. I turn around and she's smiling this tired but genuine smile. She tells me thanks again for covering that shift last month when she had that family emergency with her mom. I stand there holding a gallon of milk in each hand, trying to remember what she's talking about. Then I realize she means 3 weeks ago when I swapped shifts with her so she could handle something. She has no idea I made the call. She probably thinks it was some customer who saw Jason outside, or maybe just the cops doing a random check after they found him that night. Her gratitude for a completely different favor sits wrong in my stomach. I tell her no problem, and she goes back to her clipboard. I put the milk on the shelf, and my hands are shaking slightly. I'm living 2 lives now. The coworker who helps out when needed and the person who reported her to authorities. She'll probably never know it was me, and I don't know if that makes it better or worse. The next morning, the store manager calls everyone to the break room before opening. We all crowd in there with our coffee and tired faces wondering what's going on. He stands by the bulletin board with this serious expression and starts talking about company policy regarding employees' children on the premises. Nobody says Bridget's name, but we all know. He reminds us that liability issues prevent children from waiting inside or outside the store for extended periods. He uses phrases like risk management and corporate responsibility. Tanya catches my eye from across the room and her face is tight. Robert is staring at his shoes. The manager keeps talking about how we all need to be mindful of policies and report concerns through proper channels. Several employees shift uncomfortably because we all know this exact policy is what forced Jason outside in the cold in the first place. But nobody says anything. Nobody challenges him or points out that maybe the policy itself is the problem. We just nod and agree to follow the rules and then file out to start our shifts. Bridget isn't working this morning, and I'm grateful for that. 3 days later, I'm restocking cereal when I hear Bridget's voice from the break room. The door is open and her tone is sharp. I move closer to the doorway while pretending to organize boxes. She's on her phone arguing with someone about heat. She says it's November now and her apartment is freezing and her landlord keeps saying he'll send someone but nobody ever comes. Then her voice changes. She mentions that CPS requires adequate heating, and her caseworker is doing another home visit next week and will verify everything is up to code. There's silence while she listens. Then she says, "Okay, good, tomorrow works," and hangs up. I stand there holding a box of cornflakes, realizing what just happened. The investigation is giving her power she didn't have before. Her landlord has been ignoring her complaints for who knows how long, but suddenly CPS involvement means he has to actually fix things. That feels like something positive coming from all this mess. Something I didn't expect. I'm on Register 4 the following week when Tanya takes Register 5 next to me. It's slow, and we're just standing there watching the entrance for customers. She leans over slightly and mentions that Bridget seems different lately. Less stressed somehow. Like having the kids in an actual program with structure has lifted weight off her shoulders. I think about it and realize she's right. Bridget has been on time more often in the past few weeks. She's not constantly on her phone dealing with childcare emergencies or begging people to cover shifts. She actually seems present when she's working instead of just surviving each moment. Tanya says maybe Bridget was drowning before and too proud to ask for help. Or maybe she didn't even know help existed. I nod and scan a customer's items and think about how easy it is to judge someone's choices when you're not living their impossible circumstances. Maybe Bridget needed intervention not because she was a bad mother, but because she was a desperate one with no resources and no support system. 3 weeks after the CPS visit, Bridget comes in during the afternoon shift with her phone out showing pictures to everyone. I'm organizing the magazine rack when she spots me and waves me over. She's grinning and pulling up photos of a birthday party. It's Christopher's 4th birthday, and the after-school program helped organize it. There are pictures of all 3 kids around a table with a cake covered in blue frosting. Decorations hang from the ceiling. Other kids from the program are in the background. She swipes through showing me different shots, and her voice has this genuine happiness I haven't heard before. She points out Christopher's face covered in frosting, and Isla wearing a party hat, and Jason actually smiling next to his siblings. I look at the photos and see 3 children who look like regular kids instead of tiny adults managing crisis. They're just being kids at a birthday party. Something simple that most families take for granted but was impossible for them before. Bridget keeps talking about how the program staff went all out and how Christopher was so excited. I tell her the photos are great, and I mean it. When she walks away, I feel this complicated mix of relief and guilt that won't go away. Robert finds me in the stockroom later that week. It's quiet back there, and he's putting away produce boxes, but he stops when he sees me. He tells me his own mother was investigated by CPS when he was a kid. His voice is low, like he's sharing something private. He says it actually helped his family get connected to resources they needed. Food assistance and counseling and programs they didn't know existed. He says the system isn't perfect, and sometimes it fails people, but sometimes intervention is necessary, even when it feels like betrayal. He looks at me directly when he says this last part. I realize he's giving me permission to feel okay about what I did. His story makes the guilt slightly lighter, but I still can't shake the feeling that I crossed some invisible line by making that call. He goes back to stacking boxes, and I stand there thinking about how many families are out there struggling in silence. The caseworker comes back for a follow-up visit the next week, and I specifically requested that day off. I didn't want to risk being there when she was asking questions. I spent the day at home cleaning my apartment and trying not to think about it. Tanya texts me around 3 saying the caseworker just left. She says the woman talked to several employees who regularly interacted with Jason during his time outside. She says the caseworker seemed focused on understanding what community supports the family had, not on punishing anyone. Tanya says it felt more like building a picture of the situation than looking for someone to blame. I text back thanks for letting me know, and then sit on my couch staring at my phone. Part of me wishes I'd been there to see how it went. Part of me is relieved I wasn't. I noticed small changes in Bridget over the next few weeks. She's packing actual lunches now instead of buying clearance items from the store or skipping meals entirely. She brings a little insulated bag with a sandwich and fruit and actually takes her full break to eat. It's such a small thing, but it suggests stability. Maybe the emergency assistance means she has grocery money. Maybe not paying for last-minute babysitters means she can afford food. Maybe having a few hours when she's not in pure survival mode means she can think about basic things like packing lunch. I watch her eat a turkey sandwich in the break room and realize how much I took for granted. I've always been able to pack lunch. I've never had to choose between eating and keeping the lights on. One evening near closing, a woman comes into the store wearing a community center shirt. She's got a clipboard, and she's looking around like she's searching for someone. She spots Bridget at the customer service desk and walks over. I'm nearby organizing returns, and I can hear their conversation. The woman introduces herself as a coordinator from the after-school program. She tells Bridget that Jason has been helping the younger kids with their homework and showing real leadership skills. Bridget's face does something complicated when she hears this. Pride mixed with sadness. Like she's realizing her oldest child has been forced to grow up too fast. The coordinator keeps talking about how Jason is patient with the little kids and takes his responsibilities seriously. She mentions they have a mentorship program he might benefit from where he'd get paired with a male role model. Bridget writes down the information and thanks her. After the woman leaves, Bridget just stands there staring at the paper in her hand. I finish with the returns and head to the back room because watching her process that feels too private. I find myself watching Bridget differently now. Things I used to see as chaos and irresponsibility look more complicated when I actually pay attention. She picks up every extra shift offered even when she's clearly exhausted. She never buys anything for herself but will grab clearance toys for her kids when they go on sale. She's navigating systems designed to make poor people fail and somehow still showing up every day. I used to think she was just messy and disorganized. Now I see someone fighting to survive with limited weapons. My judgment feels less certain, less black and white. I don't know who deserves what anymore or how to measure good parenting when someone is drowning. I just know that 3 kids are safer now than they were before, and maybe that's what matters most. A slow Tuesday afternoon meant empty aisles and time for Bridget to actually talk instead of running between registers and restocking. She leaned against the customer service counter chatting with another cashier about something her caseworker had done. I was organizing the impulse buy section nearby and couldn't help overhearing. Bridget laughed while explaining that the caseworker helped her apply for subsidized housing with a 2-year waitlist. She said at least she was on it now, which was better than nothing. The other cashier asked what subsidized housing even was, and Bridget admitted she didn't know it existed in our city until last week. She thought it was just something from other places, not here. I kept straightening candy bars that didn't need straightening and thought about how many resources must be invisible when you're drowning. When you're working doubles and dealing with shut-off notices and finding babysitters, you don't have time to research what help might exist. You just survive hour by hour. Bridget kept talking about the application process and how complicated the paperwork was, but her caseworker walked her through every section. The waiting list didn't bother her as much as I expected. She seemed almost excited just to be on it, like having a possibility 2 years away was still hope. The district manager showed up the following week doing his quarterly store visits. He usually just checked inventory and talked to the store manager in the office, but this time he made a point of finding Bridget during her shift. I was covering a register 3 lanes over when he approached her at customer service. He told her he'd been reviewing employee records and noticed her improved punctuality and performance over the past month. Bridget looked surprised, like she expected criticism instead of recognition. He kept talking about how reliability was valuable, and the company needed good people in leadership positions. Then he offered her first consideration for the next assistant manager position that opened up. Better pay, consistent scheduling, actual benefits. Bridget's face went through about 5 different expressions before settling on shocked. She thanked him and said she'd definitely be interested. After he walked away, she just stood there staring at nothing for a solid minute. I wondered if anyone had ever recognized her for doing well instead of only noticing when she struggled. The idea that she could move up instead of just surviving seemed to genuinely surprise her. I saw Jason outside the store a few days later, but everything about the situation looked different. He was with a group of kids his age and 2 adults wearing community center shirts. They had clipboards and were doing some kind of nature scavenger hunt around the neighborhood. Jason was animated, actually smiling and talking with another boy about something on their list. They checked off items as they found them, leaves and rocks and other things I couldn't see from inside. The bench where he used to sit alone for hours was just background now, part of the landscape instead of his prison. He walked right past it without even glancing at it, laughing at something his friend said. The counselor with them looked patient and engaged, actually paying attention to what the kids were finding and saying. I watched them move down the sidewalk toward the park and felt something loosen in my chest. That kid who used to sit outside in the cold with a dead tablet now had friends and activities and adults who cared. The change was so visible it almost hurt to see. Tanya caught me during our overlapping break that afternoon. We were both in the back room and she brought up Bridget's situation directly. She said she was glad someone finally did something about it. Her voice was quiet but firm, like she'd been thinking about this for a while. She told me she wished she'd been brave enough to make the call herself. I didn't confirm or deny anything, but my face probably gave me away. Tanya squeezed my shoulder and said sometimes helping people means doing things they might initially hate you for. That's just part of caring about others. The guilt had been eating at me despite seeing all the positive changes. Hearing someone else say it was the right thing helped, even though I still felt weird about going behind Bridget's back. Tanya mentioned she'd been losing sleep over Jason sitting outside in the cold too, but didn't know what to do. Everyone at the store had been trapped between wanting to help and being afraid of making things worse. At least now the kids were safe and Bridget was getting support instead of just struggling alone. A month after the investigation, Bridget brought paperwork to work during her break. She spread it out on the break room table looking excited but nervous. Medical billing certificate program at the community college. She explained to anyone who'd listen that her caseworker told her about a workforce development grant covering tuition and childcare during class time. The grant specifically helped single parents get job training for better careers. She'd never heard of it before. The program was 2 evenings a week for 6 months and led to certification that could get her a job at a hospital or clinic. Better pay than retail, actual career path, normal hours. She asked the store manager if she could adjust her schedule for the classes, and he agreed immediately. Bridget kept looking at the enrollment forms like she couldn't believe this was real. She told me later that she never imagined going to college or having a career instead of just jobs. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The possibility of actually improving her situation instead of just surviving felt foreign to her. But the caseworker kept telling her she was capable and deserved better opportunities. Someone believing in her seemed to matter as much as the actual resources. I realized over the next few weeks that I'd been waiting for Bridget to figure out I made the call. Some part of me expected her to piece it together and confront me, but it was becoming clear she probably never would. The anonymous nature of the report meant I got to keep my secret and my guilt. I watched the aftermath without facing direct consequences for my choice. Part of me wished she knew so we could clear the air and I could stop carrying this weird tension. But mostly I was relieved to avoid that confrontation. What would I even say? I reported you because your kid was sleeping outside in the cold and you didn't seem to care? That sounded harsh even though it was true. The complexity of the situation made simple explanations impossible. She was failing her kids but also trapped in impossible circumstances. I helped protect the children but also went behind her back to authorities. Nothing about it felt purely good or purely bad. Just necessary and uncomfortable and permanently complicated. Robert mentioned during a restocking shift that his daughter went to the same after-school program now. She'd become friends with Isla, Bridget's 6-year-old. He said Isla talked constantly about how much she loved the program and didn't want to miss any days. They did art projects and played games and got help with homework. His daughter said Isla was always happy and excited about whatever activity they were doing. The kids who'd been left with their 10-year-old brother as babysitter were now in age-appropriate care with structured activities and adult supervision. Robert said you could see the difference in how they acted. More relaxed, more like regular kids instead of tiny adults managing crisis. Isla apparently talked about the snacks they got at the program and how she was learning to read better. Simple things that should have always been part of her life but hadn't been. The program gave them stability and safety and childhood, things their mother wanted to provide but couldn't manage alone. The store manager pulled me aside one afternoon after a particularly smooth shift. He thanked me for being a reliable employee and said he appreciated my work ethic. Then he mentioned that he knew some staff members had been concerned about Bridget's children. His wording was careful, almost too careful. He said he appreciated that someone handled it appropriately through proper channels rather than gossip or drama. The way he looked at me while saying this made me wonder if he knew or suspected I made the call. But he didn't push further and I didn't volunteer information. We just stood there for a second with this understanding hanging between us. He added that the situation had worked out better than anyone expected, and Bridget was doing well now. Then he went back to his office and I went back to my register. The conversation felt significant, but incomplete. Like he was telling me he knew without actually saying it directly. Or maybe I was reading too much into it because of my own guilt. Bridget told a group of coworkers during lunch break that her electricity hadn't been shut off in 6 weeks. She said it like an accomplishment, which I guess it was for her. 6 weeks was apparently a record this year. The emergency assistance program helped her catch up on bills and taught her about payment plans she didn't know utilities offered. You could pay a set amount each month based on income instead of the full bill. She'd been trying to pay everything at once and failing, then getting hit with shut-off notices and reconnection fees. The payment plan meant consistent smaller amounts she could actually manage. She talked about not worrying whether the lights would work when she got home. That specific relief in her voice was tangible. Such a basic thing that most people never think about. Flipping a light switch and having it work. But for her, it had been a constant source of stress and shame. Now she could focus on other things instead of that particular crisis. The stability showed in other ways too. She seemed calmer, less constantly on edge. Like removing one major stressor freed up mental space for everything else. A newer employee complained about covering one of Bridget's shifts, and I jumped to her defense without thinking. I explained that she was dealing with a lot, and had actually been much more reliable lately. The new guy didn't know Bridget's history or circumstances. He just saw someone asking for coverage and assumed she was flaky. I found myself explaining about her kids and the community programs and how much things had improved. Defending her felt natural even though months ago I'd been judging her just as harshly. I realized I'd shifted from seeing surface chaos to understanding the circumstances underneath. The complexity of her situation had become more visible to me than just the mess I initially noticed. She wasn't irresponsible or careless. She was someone trapped in systems designed to make poor people fail, fighting to survive with limited resources and no safety net. My judgment had been easy when I didn't understand the full picture. Now I saw how hard she was working just to keep her family together. That changed everything about how I viewed her choices and struggles. 3 months passed faster than I expected. The CPS caseworker walked into the store on a Tuesday afternoon while I was restocking the cereal aisle. She wore the same professional outfit from before, carrying a leather folder under her arm. My hands froze on a box of cornflakes when I spotted her heading toward the manager's office. Through the glass window, I watched her shake hands with him, then sit down across from his desk. Their conversation looked calm and businesslike. No tension in anyone's shoulders, no defensive postures or crossed arms. After about 10 minutes, she left the office and walked over to where Bridget was working the customer service counter. They talked for maybe 5 minutes, both smiling occasionally. Bridget nodded several times and even laughed once. The caseworker touched Bridget's arm briefly before leaving, like friends saying goodbye. I kept pretending to organize cereal boxes that were already perfectly straight. During our afternoon break, Bridget sat at the table in the back room eating a sandwich she'd brought from home. She mentioned to another coworker that her caseworker visit went really well. The caseworker said she was making excellent progress with everything. The parenting classes, the stable childcare arrangement, keeping up with bills, maintaining adequate food in the house. Everything was looking good enough that they might close the case after 6 months instead of keeping it open longer. Bridget sounded relieved but also proud, like she'd accomplished something significant. I dumped my coffee in the sink and rinsed the cup, listening to her talk about how different things were now compared to a few months ago. The following week, Tanya came to work carrying a white bakery box and wearing a huge smile. She gathered several coworkers in the break room during the mid-afternoon lull and told us Bridget had finished her first medical billing class. She got an A on the final exam. Tanya had organized a small celebration, asking people to chip in a few dollars for a cake from our own bakery department. 8 of us crowded into the break room when Bridget came in for her scheduled break. We all yelled surprise and she actually jumped, putting her hand over her heart. The cake had "Congratulations, Bridget," written in blue frosting. Her eyes got wet immediately, and she kept saying she couldn't believe we did this. She cut the cake with shaky hands while people clapped. When she took the first bite, tears were running down her face. She told us that nobody had ever made a fuss about her accomplishments before. Not when she graduated high school, not when any of her kids were born, never. She kept wiping her eyes and laughing at herself for crying over a grocery store cake. Watching her accept this simple recognition made something warm spread through my chest. These were good people I worked with. People who noticed when someone was struggling and when someone was succeeding. People who cared enough to celebrate the small victories that meant everything to someone like Bridget. A few days later, I was working the register during the after-school rush when the community center group came through. About 15 kids with 3 adults, all wearing matching yellow name tags. They were doing some kind of field trip about nutrition and shopping. I recognized Bridget's 3 kids immediately. Christopher was holding hands with one of the adults, skipping along and pointing at colorful packages. Isla walked with 2 other girls her age, all of them giggling about something. Jason was toward the back of the group with a boy about his height. This time Jason looked directly at me while they passed. He raised his hand in a small wave and smiled. Just a quick, normal kid smile before turning back to whatever his friend was saying. Something about his face looked different. Lighter somehow. The weight that used to press down on his shoulders seemed less heavy. He was still a serious kid. You could see it in his eyes, that awareness of responsibility that most 10-year-olds don't carry. But there were moments now, like when his friend made him laugh, where he looked like he was allowed to just be 10. Not a parent substitute or a babysitter or a guardian. Just a kid with friends doing normal kid things. Thursday evening was slow, only a few customers wandering the aisles. Bridget and I were both assigned to stock shelves in the canned goods section. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, just the sound of cans sliding onto metal shelves. Then Bridget started talking about her parenting class. She said the instructor taught them about realistic expectations for children at different developmental stages. She was realizing she'd been asking Jason to do things no 10-year-old should handle. Watching 2 younger siblings for hours. Making dinner. Getting everyone ready for bed. Making sure the doors were locked and everyone was safe. She said desperation made her rationalize bad choices as necessary. She convinced herself Jason was mature enough, responsible enough, capable enough. But he wasn't. He was just a kid who learned to act like an adult because he had no choice. Her voice got quiet when she talked about it. Thoughtful instead of defensive. I told her that survival mode makes everyone do things they wouldn't choose otherwise. That when you're drowning, you grab whatever keeps you afloat even if it's not the right thing. She looked at me with such gratitude, like I'd given her permission to forgive herself. We went back to stocking shelves, but the air between us felt easier. The store announced new management the following month. The old district manager transferred to another region, and we got a new assistant manager who came from a store in a different state. Her first week, she called individual meetings with employees to learn about their situations and needs. When Bridget came back from her meeting, she looked stunned. The new assistant manager was much more flexible about scheduling for employees with childcare needs. She understood that parents couldn't just work whatever random shifts the computer system assigned. Bridget got consistent evening shifts, 5 to 9 p.m., Monday through Friday. Those hours aligned perfectly with the after-school program schedule. The kids went there right after school and stayed until 7. Bridget could pick them up at 7 and still make it home by 7:30. No more scrambling for last-minute coverage. No more bringing kids to work. No more leaving them in situations they were too young to handle. The structural change made more difference than any individual intervention could have. One person in management who understood that employees were human beings with real lives and real limitations. That simple flexibility transformed Bridget's entire situation more than any parenting class or caseworker visit. I was taking out recycling through the back hallway when I heard Bridget's voice from around the corner. She was on her phone, laughing about something. I paused, not wanting to interrupt her break. Her voice carried clearly in the empty hallway. She was confirming her next appointment with her caseworker, still laughing about whatever they'd been discussing. The conversation sounded friendly, collaborative, like talking to someone who was helping rather than monitoring. She mentioned something about the kids' report cards and how well everyone was doing. Then she laughed again and said she'd see her next week. The relationship seemed collaborative rather than adversarial. It made me think about how I'd been, so scared that calling CPS would destroy her family. That fear hadn't come true. Instead, the investigation connected them to support systems that were actually helping. Good caseworkers could be allies rather than enemies. People who understood that struggling parents needed resources and support, not judgment and punishment. 4 months after the investigation, I overheard Bridget talking to Robert near the produce section. She was telling him about her budget, how she'd been saving money for the first time in years. Not paying for emergency babysitters meant an extra $100 a month. Not getting hit with late fees on bills meant another $50. Not having the electricity shut off meant no reconnection fees. She'd opened a savings account and was putting away $75 every paycheck. She was planning to take the kids to visit her mother in another state during Christmas break. A real vacation with a hotel and everything. Her mother hadn't seen the kids in almost 2 years because Bridget could never afford the trip. Now she was booking plane tickets and researching things to do in her mom's city. The stability in her voice when she talked about future plans instead of just surviving the present day was striking. She wasn't just reacting to the next crisis anymore. She was actually planning ahead, thinking about next month and next year instead of just tomorrow. Robert found me in the break room later that week. He sat down across from me with his coffee and mentioned casually that his daughter said something interesting at dinner. Isla had told her class during sharing time that her family was doing much better now, and her mom was going to college. His daughter came home talking about it because she thought it was cool that Isla's mom was in the school just like the kids. Robert looked at me with this meaningful expression while he said it. His eyes held understanding and approval. I realized he definitely knew I made the call. Maybe he'd figured it out from how I'd been watching Bridget and her kids. Maybe Tanya had told him. Maybe he just put the pieces together. We didn't discuss it directly. But there was an understanding between us that sometimes caring about people means making hard choices they might not initially thank you for. Sometimes helping requires doing uncomfortable things. He finished his coffee and went back to work, leaving me sitting there with my own thoughts about choices and consequences. The next evening, I was pushing carts back from the parking lot when I saw the community center counselor talking with Bridget near the store entrance. They stood by the bench where Jason used to sit for hours. The same metal bench that used to be his prison. Now it was just part of the landscape. The counselor was a woman in her 30s wearing casual clothes and a lanyard with the community center logo. She was discussing Jason's progress in the mentorship program. Her voice carried across the parking lot in the quiet evening air. She mentioned that Jason's mentor was a teacher who'd been working with him on processing his feelings about having so much responsibility at home. The mentor was helping Jason understand that what happened wasn't his fault, that he shouldn't have been put in that position, that being a kid was okay. Bridget listened seriously, asking questions about how Jason was responding to the sessions, whether he was opening up, whether the counselor thought it was helping. She seemed genuinely engaged with helping her son heal from what he experienced, not defensive or dismissive. Just a mom trying to understand how to support her kid through something difficult. The staff meeting happened on a Monday morning before the store opened. All employees gathered in the break room, standing around because there weren't enough chairs. The store manager stood at the front looking pleased about something. He announced that Bridget was promoted to assistant manager starting next month. The position came with a significant raise, $3 more per hour, and benefits including health insurance for her family. Everyone applauded and Bridget's face went red. She looked overwhelmed in the best way, like she couldn't quite believe this was happening to her. People congratulated her and she kept thanking everyone. After the meeting, she caught me by the time clock. She told me privately that 6 months ago she never imagined anything getting better. She thought she'd be stuck in the same desperate situation forever, just barely surviving, always one crisis away from everything falling apart. Now her whole life was different. She had stable childcare, consistent work hours, money in savings, health insurance coming, and a promotion she never thought she'd get. Her voice cracked when she said it, and I told her she earned every bit of it. A few weeks went by, and Tanya and I ended up closing together on a Tuesday night. The store was dead after 9, just us doing cleanup and restocking while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. She was wiping down the deli counter, and I was organizing the magazine rack when she walked over and stood next to me. She didn't say anything at first, just helped straighten the displays. Then she told me directly that she knew I made the call about Jason. Her voice was quiet but certain. She said it was the right thing to do even though it was scary. She could tell by how I'd been watching Bridget and her kids over the past few months, like I was checking whether my choice helped or hurt them. My hand stopped moving and I just stood there holding a stack of gossip magazines. I finally admitted it was me. Saying it out loud to someone who understood felt like releasing pressure I didn't know I was holding. She squeezed my shoulder and said she'd been losing sleep over not calling herself, that seeing Jason outside in the cold had haunted her. We finished closing in comfortable silence, both of us carrying less weight than we had an hour before. The next week, the CPS caseworker came back for what I learned later was her final visit. I was stocking shelves in the cereal aisle when I saw her talking with Bridget near the customer service desk. I moved closer while pretending to organize boxes, close enough to hear their conversation. The caseworker told Bridget that the case was closed successfully because she'd maintained stable housing, consistent childcare, and real engagement with support services. Her voice was warm, not the cold bureaucrat tone I'd imagined. She said Bridget should be proud of the changes she'd made for her family. Bridget thanked her, and her voice got thick when she mentioned that the intervention was hard at first, really hard, but it ultimately helped her access resources she desperately needed. She said she didn't know those programs existed until the caseworker connected her. They shook hands and the caseworker left, and I stayed in the cereal aisle processing what I'd heard. Bridget wasn't angry about the call anymore. She was grateful. 2 days later, Bridget brought all 3 kids into the store on her day off. She wanted to show them where she worked, and they were excited to see the place their mom talked about all the time. Christopher and Isla ran around looking at everything with wide eyes, pointing at the bakery displays and the flower section. Jason stayed closer to Bridget, still her serious and protective oldest, even though he looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. She walked them through each department and introduced them to coworkers with obvious pride. Robert gave them each an apple from produce. Tanya snuck them cookies from the bakery. The kids were well behaved and polite, saying thank you without being prompted. They'd clearly benefited from having structure and stability in their lives. Watching them together as an actual family instead of people just surviving felt important somehow. I caught Bridget alone by the time clock later that week. I told her directly that I was proud of how she'd turned things around. She thanked me and mentioned that having people at work who didn't judge her made a huge difference during the hardest time. She said she knew some coworkers probably thought she was a terrible mom, but others like me and Tanya and Robert treated her like a person who was struggling, not a failure. The irony of her gratitude sat heavy in my chest. I was the one who reported her. I was the one who set everything in motion. But I was starting to accept that my judgment and my action both came from caring about her kids' safety. Morality was more complicated than I thought. Sometimes you can judge someone's choices as dangerous while still caring about them as a person. A woman from the after-school program came into the store the following Tuesday looking for Bridget. She introduced herself as the program director and told Bridget that Jason had been selected for a summer leadership camp that was fully funded. She thought he'd really benefit from the experience. Bridget immediately said yes and asked what paperwork she needed to complete. The director mentioned that the camp focused on helping kids who'd experienced family stress develop healthy coping skills. Bridget didn't get defensive or bristle at the implication. She just nodded and said that sounded perfect for him. She asked questions about what he'd need to bring and whether he'd be comfortable being away from home for a week. The director assured her they had counselors trained to work with kids like Jason, kids who'd been forced to grow up too fast. After she left, Bridget looked at me and said she never imagined her kids would get opportunities like this. During a slow afternoon shift a week later, Bridget and I were both stuck at registers with no customers. She started telling me about her plans after finishing the medical billing certificate. She wanted to get a job at a hospital or clinic with better pay and benefits than retail offered. She talked about being able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment so the kids didn't all share one room. She mentioned maybe even saving for a car so she wasn't dependent on buses and could get to work reliably. Her dreams were modest but real. She believed they were achievable now, which was different from before when she'd seemed trapped in permanent crisis mode. She pulled out her phone and showed me apartment listings she'd been looking at, places that would be possible once she had that clinic job. The hope in her voice made something tight in my chest loosen. I saw Jason outside the store one last time a few days later. But everything was different. He was with his mentor from the program, and they were getting ice cream from the shop next door. I watched them through the window while pretending to adjust the shopping cart corral. Jason was laughing at something his mentor said, looking relaxed and happy in a way I'd never seen during all those months he spent waiting outside. The bench where he used to spend countless cold and lonely hours was visible behind them, empty now. It was just a regular bench again, not a symbol of neglect. The change that had happened in just a few months felt huge. That small boy who used to fall asleep there with a dead tablet was becoming a regular kid with a mentor and summer camp and after-school friends. Tanya mentioned during our next overlapping shift that she'd started volunteering with the community center's after-school program. Seeing how much it helped Bridget's kids made her want to contribute. Robert told me he'd been donating to their fundraisers and spreading the word about their services to other employees who had kids. The ripple effect of one intervention had made several people more aware of how struggling families need community support, not just judgment. We'd all been complicit in Jason's suffering by staying silent, making ourselves feel better with small gestures like soup and apples. Now we were trying to actually help prevent other kids from ending up in similar situations. It didn't undo our earlier failure, but it was something. 6 months after I made that anonymous call, Bridget completed her medical billing certificate. She got hired at a clinic with regular hours, better pay, and full benefits including health insurance for her whole family. She gave her 2 weeks' notice at the store. We threw her a going-away party during her last shift, decorating the break room with streamers and getting a cake from the bakery department. She made a speech thanking everyone for supporting her through a difficult time. Her voice broke when she talked about how scared she'd been that she'd never get out of the cycle of poverty and chaos. Several coworkers got emotional. Tanya cried. Even Robert's eyes looked wet. Bridget had become more than just the chaotic coworker who was always late. She'd become someone we all rooted for. On Bridget's last day, she pulled me aside near the employee lockers after her final shift. She told me she knew someone from the store called CPS that night about Jason. She said she was angry at first, furious actually, but she was grateful now because it forced her to accept help she was too proud to ask for. She didn't say she knew it was me specifically, but her eye contact suggested she might suspect. She held my gaze for a long moment. I told her that her kids were lucky to have a mom who fights so hard for them. I meant it completely. She'd taken the intervention and used it to build something better instead of just resenting the intrusion. That took real strength. She hugged me tight and then headed out with her kids trailing behind her, all 3 of them talking at once about something they wanted to do that weekend. I watched them leave through the automatic doors and felt this weird mix of pride and sadness. The store got a new person to take Bridget's position about a week later. Her name was Michelle, and she was always exactly on time. Never asked anyone to cover her shifts, kept her personal life completely separate from work. She was efficient and reliable and honestly kind of boring compared to Bridget's constant chaos. I caught myself missing the drama sometimes. Missing Bridget rushing in 20 minutes late with some wild story about why the bus broke down, or her landlord showing up at 6 a.m., or one of the kids getting sick at the school. Michelle just showed up, did her job perfectly, and went home. There was something about Bridget's messiness that made the store feel more human, more real. She reminded everyone that we were all just people trying to survive, not robots scanning groceries. I realized she taught me something important about judging other people's choices when you have no idea what impossible situation they're dealing with. It's easy to say what someone should do when you're not the one trying to keep 3 kids fed on retail wages with no childcare and an apartment that keeps losing power. 3 months after Bridget left, I was doing my own grocery shopping on my day off, and I saw her in the produce section with all 3 kids. They were picking out vegetables together, and the kids were actually helping instead of running around causing chaos. Jason was reading labels to his mom and helping her compare prices. Isla was carefully selecting apples and putting them in a bag. Christopher was sitting in the cart seat looking happy and well-rested. Bridget looked completely different from she used to at work. Her hair was styled, her clothes matched, and she wasn't frantically checking her phone every 30 seconds or yelling at anyone. She saw me and her whole face lit up. She came over and we hugged like old friends instead of former coworkers who barely knew each other outside of work stress. She told me the clinic job was going amazing and they were already training her on additional responsibilities because she was so good at it. She said having regular hours and knowing exactly when she'd be home every day changed everything for her family. The kids could plan their activities, she could plan meals, they could have actual routines instead of just chaos. She thanked me again for being supportive during her hard time at the store and said she thought about us sometimes and hoped everyone was doing okay. We hugged goodbye, and I watched her finish shopping with her kids, all of them relaxed and happy in a way I never saw when she was drowning at the store. A couple weeks later, Tanya pulled me aside during a shift and said she heard something interesting at a district meeting. Apparently, our store manager mentioned Bridget's story as an example of how connecting struggling employees with community resources can help everyone. The company was now looking into developing partnerships with local service organizations to help other employees who might be dealing with similar situations. Tanya said it felt weird that one person's crisis was leading to actual systemic changes, but maybe that's how things get better sometimes. One family falls apart publicly enough that people notice and decide to build better safety nets for others. It didn't undo all the months that Jason spent sitting outside in the cold, or all the nights Bridget's kids went to bed hungry, but it might prevent other families from reaching that same breaking point. That felt like something meaningful coming from something so painful. I started seeing Jason around the neighborhood sometimes after that. He'd be walking with a couple other kids his age, laughing about something, looking like a normal preteen instead of a tiny adult carrying the weight of his family. Sometimes he was with an older guy who I figured must be his mentor from that program. They'd be getting ice cream or throwing a football in the park or just talking while they walked. Jason was getting taller and filling out a bit, not so skinny and tired looking anymore. I wondered sometimes if he remembered all those hours outside the store, or if kids are resilient enough that the trauma doesn't stick the same way it would for adults. Maybe he'd grow up and barely remember the worst parts, just have this vague sense that things were hard when he was little, but then they got better. Or maybe those memories would stay with him forever, shape how he saw the world and his place in it. I hoped for the first option, but suspected the second was more likely. Robert and I were restocking the cooler together one evening, and somehow got on the topic of how Bridget was doing. He mentioned that his daughter was in the same class as Isla now, and said she was one of the happiest kids there. Apparently, Isla talked constantly about activities she did with her family, about going to the park and the library and community center events. Robert's daughter said Isla used to be really quiet and kind of sad-looking, but now she was always smiling and participating in class. The younger kids who were basically invisible in the original crisis were thriving in ways that probably wouldn't have been possible without someone intervening. Hearing that made me feel like maybe I did the right thing even though it felt terrible at the time. Their well-being justified my choice more than anything else could. 3 kids were safe and happy and getting to be actual kids instead of surviving in situations no child should have to handle. I thought about that night a lot. The night I found Jason asleep on the bench and made the call that changed everything. I still felt guilty about going behind Bridget's back, about judging another woman's mothering, about potentially putting kids into a system that doesn't always help. But I also knew that doing nothing would have meant watching a child suffer while I protected my own comfort and workplace relationships. Staying silent would have been easier, but it wouldn't have been right. Sometimes the moral choice is also the uncomfortable choice, the one that makes you lose sleep and second-guess yourself and wonder if you had any right to interfere in someone else's family. I made peace with the guilt by accepting that I'd rather feel bad about helping than feel bad about doing nothing. Tanya and I ended up having a long conversation during a slow shift about how many people probably see situations like Bridget's and stay silent because it's easier than getting involved. We both admitted that we were part of that silence for too long, making small gestures like sneaking Jason food instead of addressing the real problem. Giving him soup and apples made us feel better about ourselves, but it didn't actually help him. The collective responsibility for his suffering sat heavy between us, but at least we eventually acted. At least someone finally did something instead of just feeling bad and hoping it would somehow get better on its own. We talked about how our whole society is kind of set up that way, where everyone sees problems, but nobody wants to be the one to actually intervene because it's messy and complicated and might make things worse. But sometimes making things worse temporarily is still better than letting them stay terrible indefinitely. About a year after the whole CPS investigation started, I was scrolling through Facebook during my lunch break and saw a post from Bridget. It showed all 3 kids on the first day of school, wearing new clothes and backpacks, standing in front of their apartment building and smiling at the camera. The caption talked about how far they'd come in the past year and how grateful she was for the community support that helped her family get stable. She mentioned the after-school program, the clinic job, the parenting classes, all the resources that connected together to pull them out of crisis. Reading it made me cry in a way I didn't expect, sitting there in my car in the parking lot with tears running down my face. Something I'd been carrying since that cold night in November finally released. The guilt didn't disappear, but it transformed into something easier to live with, knowing that the intervention led to actual positive change instead of just more trauma. I realized sitting there that I'd probably never tell Bridget directly that I made the call, and I was okay with that now. The outcome mattered more than my need for confession, or getting credit, or clearing my conscience through some dramatic revelation. Her kids were safe and cared for. She was building a better life, and the intervention connected them to resources that were genuinely helping them thrive. My guilt was something I could live with if it meant they were okay. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be true. Robert mentioned during a closing shift a few days later that he was glad we worked at a store where people actually cared about each other, even when caring meant making difficult choices. He said it while we were counting down the registers. Just casual conversation that felt deeper than it sounded. He was right, though. We weren't just coworkers going through the motions to collect a paycheck. We were people who saw a child in danger and eventually did something about it. That mattered more than any awkwardness or guilt or worry about workplace drama. We chose to protect a kid over protecting our own comfort, and that's something I could feel good about even when everything else about the situation felt complicated and messy. I think about all the children like Jason who are sitting outside stores right now, or staying home alone or taking care of younger siblings because their parents are stuck in impossible situations. The problems that created Bridget's crisis haven't gone anywhere. Poverty wages that make it impossible to afford childcare while working full-time. Unstable scheduling that makes planning ahead a joke. Lack of support services that actually help instead of just judging. One family getting connected to resources doesn't fix the broken systems that endanger so many others. There are kids all over this city, and every city dealing with the same thing Jason dealt with, and most of them won't have someone make that call. Most of them will just keep sitting on benches or watching their younger siblings or missing school because their parents are trapped between impossible choices. The grocery store hired Bridget's replacement, and she's punctual and organized and never brings chaos to work, but I guarantee she's struggling too in ways we don't see. Everyone working retail is one emergency away from crisis. Everyone is juggling more than they can handle. The difference is just whether that juggling act stays invisible or becomes visible enough that someone has to respond. I see parents coming through my checkout line every day who look exhausted and stressed and like they're barely holding it together. I wonder how many of them are leaving kids alone or making dangerous childcare choices because they literally have no other options. The systems that are supposed to help families are so hard to access and so complicated to navigate that people give up or never try in the first place. Bridget only got help because someone reported her and forced intervention. How many families are suffering in silence because nobody reports them, and they don't know how to ask for help themselves? But I also know that fixing poverty and childcare and all those big problems happen slowly while children need help right now. Making that call didn't solve the childcare crisis, or raise wages, or create more support services. It didn't fix any of the broken systems. But it did help 3 specific kids who were suffering. It connected one family to resources that made their lives better. Sometimes the only choice is between imperfect action that might help someone right now and comfortable inaction that definitely helps nobody. I chose action even though it was messy and complicated and didn't feel heroic at all. Even though I still feel guilty about going behind Bridget's back and judging her choices and potentially making things worse. The action I took wasn't pure or simple or clearly right, but it was better than doing nothing while watching children suffer. I could have kept walking past Jason on that bench every night and kept feeling bad about it and kept hoping someone else would do something. That would have been easier and more comfortable for me. But easier and more comfortable doesn't mean better when actual kids are cold and hungry and unsafe. The discomfort I felt making that call and the guilt I still carry are prices worth paying if it meant those 3 children got help they desperately needed. Tanya tells me during a closing shift a few weeks after Bridget left that she's been talking to other parents at her kids' school about community resources and support programs. She's spreading information that might help families before they reach crisis point. She mentions the after-school program and the emergency assistance and the subsidized housing list and all the things she learned from watching Bridget's situation. Robert has been volunteering on weekends to help low-income families navigate social services applications because he says the paperwork is designed to make people give up. He helps them fill out forms and gather documents and understand what they qualify for. We're all trying to turn our guilt about not acting sooner into something productive. Trying to help other families before someone has to make an anonymous call about their kids. It doesn't erase what we failed to do for months while Jason sat outside, but it's something. It's using what we learned to maybe prevent the next kid from ending up in that situation. Tanya says she wishes we'd all known about these resources earlier, so we could have told Bridget about them before things got so bad. I agree, but I also know that people in crisis often can't hear suggestions or accept help until they're forced to. Bridget might not have used those resources even if we'd told her because she was too overwhelmed and proud and convinced she had to handle everything alone. Sometimes intervention has to be forced because people can't save themselves no matter how much they need saving. A year and a half after that cold November night when I found Jason asleep on the bench, I'm at peace with my choice to call CPS, even though it still doesn't feel purely good or simple. I helped protect children who were in danger, and that mattered more than my discomfort, or Bridget's initial anger, or the messiness of involving authorities. Sometimes doing the right thing means living with complicated feelings forever. Sometimes moral clarity is overrated compared to kids being safe and families getting the support they desperately need. I don't regret making the call, but I also don't feel heroic about it. It was just a necessary thing that someone had to do, and I happened to be the person who did it. Bridget's kids are safe now and thriving, and that's what matters. The fact that it took a crisis and an investigation to get them help is a failure of the systems that should have supported them before things got that bad. But within those broken systems, I made a choice that helped 3 specific children, and I can live with the complicated feelings that choice created. I learned that caring about people sometimes means doing things they might hate you for. That protecting the vulnerable sometimes requires uncomfortable action, instead of comfortable sympathy. That watching someone struggle and feeling bad about it isn't the same as actually helping them. I'm learning to live in the gray area between judging Bridget's choices and understanding her impossible situation. Between respecting her as a mother doing her best, and acknowledging that her best wasn't keeping her children safe. Between systemic problems that trap people and individual responsibility for the choices we make within those traps. Moral clarity would be easier, but kids being safe matters more than my comfort with ambiguity. That's where we'll end for today. I'm really grateful you took the time to listen. I hope it left your heart feeling a little lighter.